Welcome to Population and Climate, an easy variable to change. I'm Amanda Ravenhill, the Executive Director of Drawdown, and I am honored to introduce Malcolm Potts, our guest speaker for the day. Malcolm is a human reproductive scientist and professor of public health at the School of Public Health at University of California, Berkeley. He completed a medical degree and a PhD from University of Cambridge. And he also, while he was there, started the first clinic offering contraceptives to young children, or young people.
Not children. People.
Not children. He also advised on the 1967 Abortion Act in the UK. And he became the first medical doctor at the International Planned Parenthood Federation in 1968, and first CEO of Family Health International. It just goes on and on. He also became the largest global AIDS prevention, FHI became the largest global AIDS prevention program outside of the World Health Organization during this time. He's published over 10 books and 350 scientific articles. And he's worked as a consultant for the World Bank and serves on many boards. He just completed his term limit with Population Services International after 42 years, was it?
Yes. Wow.
And serves on many other boards and has directed many other programs in the population field. He's known for being really bold and taking on difficult challenges with great courage. And he's an inspiration to many of us on the team at Project Drawdown and beyond around the world. It's truly an honor to have you here with us, and thank you so much for taking the time.
I'm very happy to be a part of this. It's a new experience for me to be communicating to people around the world in this way, and I think that's very exciting. It's the wave of the future. So, some people get a little bit embarrassed by things to do with family planning. So I am wearing my condom tie, which I hope you can see in the Skype. And the students at Berkeley call me the professor with the condom ties. So I want to talk about population, about family planning, about the way in which women wish to have fewer children. And I want to break up my talk so that you can ask me questions at various times.
Amanda, we're not seeing the presentation.
I can see it here. Doesn't matter.
I'm showing the slides now. Is that what you'd like?
Good. Yes. Okay, so I see population as the elephant in the room, but it is a very friendly elephant, even though a lot of people don't want to talk about it. So let's look at the big picture of population growth since 1750, or basically since over my lifetime. So the yellow bars are the increase in population, the excess births over deaths in each decade that is marked by the vertical columns. And the yellow line are the developed countries. This growth of population goes down in the 1940s because of World War II. The purple bars are the developing countries. And the takeaway message here is that these decades, really, the year 2000 to 2020, are the decades of the most rapid population growth in the world. So let's look at those same figures in another way, because it's so difficult to understand very large numbers. We have 86.5 million more births and deaths each year on this planet. That's a new Germany to fit somewhere on this crowded planet. Nearly all those growth in population is in the least developed countries. And again, these numbers are difficult to grasp. But if we think about it as 250, a quarter of a million more people every day, or in the case of the developing world, 162 additional people every minute. So this is really the power of compound interest. So in my lifetime, I've seen two attitudes towards international family planning. One was the perception that population growth was very important. And that was really from the 1960s to the early 1990s. But that was at a time when the world's population growth annual increase was at its maximum rate. But because the base of people, population growth was lower, the increased every year was 68 million more births and deaths in the 1960s and 70s. Nowadays, the increase in the global population has gone down to 1%, but there's many, many more people, more than 7.3 billion people, so the annual increase is 85 million. I think that politically there was a lot of awareness about the so-called population explosion in the up until the 1990s, and there was a small amount of money invested. It was very visible and it was very controversial, but I think the work that we did in Asia and Latin America was associated with a very rapid decline in fertility, and that drove a lot of economic development. It lifted a lot of people out of poverty. In 1994, there was a international conference on population development in Cairo, and that shifted the focus on family planning. It said family planning is important, but it's not our priority. We should be doing other things to help women, which I think we'd all agree with, and we should do something to increase women's education, to their role in society. But really, the focus was taken off family planning, and budgets, the small budgets that had been used, almost disappeared. And so if we look at a country like Kenya, where the total fertility rate, that is the average number of children a woman has in her lifetime, fell from over 8 to something over 5. But then when the focus was taken off family planning, that decline ended. This was an entirely voluntary family planning program, but it needed some advertisement, it needed some people that were dedicated to making contraceptives available. They were taken away. And so the total fertility rate rose marginally, but the implications of that are very important. The implication is that in 2050, Kenya will have 12 million more people than it would have had if the focus had not been taken off population. To put that number in perspective, when I first went to Kenya in 1969, the total population of the country was 12 million. So let's look at projections for the world population. The median UN projection is just over 10 billion people in the year 2100. And the lower band, the blue band, which is called high, those are the least developed countries, and they will make the greatest contribution to the world population. They're also where the greatest problems of food, security, governance, and health and welfare will be concentrated. This is the low projection, and if family planning was made available and we did things that we know how to do, and we put a small amount of money in, the world might only have 6.2 billion people in 2100. But if we continue our present business as usual, the world could have 16 billion people in 2100. And the important thing to understand is that although climatologists and most people looking at, for instance, carbon footprints, take the median projection, if you talk to the demographers who run the UN Population Division, they will tell you that those three things are all equally likely. They're all open to change according to the policies and money that we invest in this field. So far, any questions or commentary? There's the really big picture that the choices of investment and the policies we put into place now will have leverage on whether the world that our children and grandchildren inherit at the end of this century will have just over 6 billion people or 16 billion people.
Thank you.
Do people type in questions, or they do them by audio, Annabelle? Or?
There'll be a combination of people typing in questions that I'll speak, or there might be people coming in via video. Mohammed is here on via video. If you have any questions, Mohammed, you can just turn on your video. And so the 10 billion number that most people throw around, that's the kind of median number, right?
Yes. Yeah.
And that's expectation that it will level out and kind of stay at 10 billion, correct?
But the difference between 10 billion and 15.8 billion is that on average, every woman has half a child more. The difference between 10 billion and 6.2 billion is every woman on average has half a child less. So very small differences in family size, which is very, very sensitive to the access that people have to contraception, can make a huge difference over many decades. So even if we meet the medium thing, we've got a big question. Can we feed that number of people?
Yeah.
And already there's a lot of hungry people in the world. And you're very focused, as I am, and all reasonable people are, on climate change. And that's already taken place. It's taken place here in California. It's taking place in India, where the water table is falling very rapidly. And it seems to me, I'm not an expert in this field, that it's perfectly plausible that by the end of the century, the Himalayan glaciers could begin to melt. And that would threaten the food supplies of the people that are fed by the Ganges and the Indus and the Yangtze and all these other rivers. So I'm going to take some examples from Africa, where we're working at the present moment, and where this collision of very rapid population growth and climate change poses the most serious threat to food security. But in the short term, the climate change may produce more rainfall, but it will come as flash floods, but it'll also be rising, falling crops. So I hope most of you know the name of Norman Borlaug. He was a wonderful agriculturalist, and he really was the father of the Green Revolution, and he received the Nobel Prize for this. My wife met him several times, and in his Nobel Prize speech, he said, you know, the Green Revolution's a great thing, but it gives us a breathing space, and we must fight for what in those days they population control. We must in a common effort. And we haven't had that fight and that common effort, and that's why we're seeing very serious threats. So just looking at water, even in a very short time zone, there's a serious, the number of people who living in countries with some degree of water shortages will increase very significantly by 2 billion just in the next decade. These problems are upon us. And if we look at the Nile, the blue and the white Nile, I've been lucky enough to see the origins of both these great rivers. I spent a lot of time in Egypt. I've been to Khartoum, where they meet together. But if you just look at the numbers, the giant growth in the number of people who will be almost totally dependent for their food supply on these two great rivers is just going to go through the roof. And the rivers aren't going to get any bigger. And the Nile is almost depleted by the time it reaches the Mediterranean at the present moment. So these are uncontrovertible, unambiguous facts of a very, very serious threat to food supply and water security. But I want to focus on the Sahel. Sahel is the Arabic word for shore. It is that ecologically defined zone, very vulnerable to climate change. It is the semi-arid area below the Sahara Desert, the shore of the Sahara Desert. And it goes, if we look at the countries that it goes across, from the Atlantic to the Red Sea, in Niger, the total fertility rate is almost 8. We couldn't find a picture with half a child on it, so you have to imagine that the little child being held in its mother's arm is half a child. You are looking at a picture of the average family size in Niger, in a country where the climate is going to wither the crops and kill the cattle. I think most of you, I hope, are familiar with population pyramids, where you simply pile up the absolute number of people in different age groups, starting with 0 to 5 and 5 to 10 and 10 to 15, etc. You need to look at these pyramids very carefully because they are to the same scale. In 1950, you can hardly see the population of Niger. There are very, very few people. Today, there's a rapidly expanding pyramid, and by the middle of the century, you'll have an extraordinarily rapid population growth. And because we've taken the focus on family planning, because we didn't do in Africa what we should have done, and which we had done in Asia and Latin America, there's a lot of very young people. The median age of many of the countries in the Sahel is 15 or 17 years old. So even if everybody had 2 children tomorrow, which won't happen, there'd still be rapid population growth because there's so many young people entering the fertile years. We all know that China has a one-child policy. The average is probably about between 1.5 and 1.8 children. But even though they have less than replacement level fertility, the population of China grows each year by 7 million more births and deaths because there are so many young women entering the fertile years. And that's going to happen in the Sahel. So the other problem in the countries we're working with at present is child marriage. I mean, I see that as a human rights abuse, but it also has a tremendous demographic impact for two reasons. One is that women often have 2 or 3 children by the time they're 20. But secondly, they are not really able to manage their fertility if they've already had several children. They just become breeding machines, if I can call them that. So conversely, if you can put up the age of marriage by 5 years in a country like Niger, you cut the birth rate by 25%, even without doing anything about contraception, simply because the women aren't being exposed to pregnancy. So this is an iconic picture which we've made. The blue bars are the UN projected populations for the Sahel, going back to 30 million in 1950, 125 today, and by the middle of this century, when most of the people that I think listening to me talking now will, I hope, still be very much alive, there will be more people in the Sahel than there are in the United States of America without anything to eat. And clearly, the 600 million projection is totally implausible. It simply tells you how many people will die and suffer if we don't change our policies. And it's beginning to be recognized in this particular picture. The vehicles in the foreground are military vehicles. And we're all familiar with Boko Haram, Al-Qaeda in the Sahel. These are areas. Chad has the most corrupt country in the world. These are areas where you're getting more and more conflict and insecurity, and where we're working in northern Nigeria, about 150 miles away from Boko Haram, is trying to capture and rape girls. We're trying to keep girls in secondary school. It's a very dramatic juxtaposition. And so is this. This is for Niger, the blue line, which is a exponential growth. You can see this line climbing up as the years pass. This is to 2012, and it's going to continue to go up. If you imagine that sort of J-shaped thing going up very rapidly, that's the population. The red line is the cereal production. Now, in 1798, a gentleman called Thomas Malthus said, population when unchecked increases in a geometrical ratio. That you can see, the blue line. Subsistence increases only in an arithmetical ratio. You can see that there. The red line. He said a slight acquaintance with numbers will show the immensity of the first power in comparison to the second. It's more than 200 years since Malthus wrote. Many people are being criticized. Many people say, oh, you know, all the problems, world's problems are going to be solved. I don't think they are. I think we should have, that if Malthus was alive today, he was a very nice English clergyman, he said, wow, I was right. So, another thing we have to think of is the need for large-scale action quickly. Mali is another one of these Sahelian countries. If they all had 2 children, replacement level fertility, by 2020, the lower blue line, their population would still grow from where it is today, which is about 16 million, to 25 million. They're not going to have 2 children there. If they did have good family planning and they had 2 children by 2040, they'd reach 30 million. If they don't get there by 2060, they reach an impossible 45 million. Again, this is a dry country, enormous poverty, very little literacy, particularly among women. Another way of demonstrating what we need to do is the following. The blue line here is the population of Ethiopia. Ethiopia has good policies in relation to family planning. They've made it a priority. They've legalized safe abortion. And the contraceptive prevalence rate, that is the number of married women who are using the modern contraceptive, is increasing by 2.3% a year, which is pretty rapid for a social change. Niger, nobody's done anything, and there the contraceptive prevalence rate's been going up at 0.05% per year. But if you project out the consequences of these two numbers, which, you know, at first glance don't look very important, the implications are stunning. So if Niger continues with business as usual, they'll have 565 million. That's many more people living in the United States of America in a comparatively small country, which is mostly desert, by the year 2100. Of course, they won't have that, but it emphasizes the choices that have to be made. The UN Convention Against Desertification says there could be 60 million ecological refugees by 2020. I'm a realist, and I don't think it's quite as pessimistic as that, but I do think that there'll be tens of millions of ecological refugees by the middle of the century. We are already seeing the horrible, the obscene, the totally unacceptable exploitation that takes place when people try to move to places with more opportunities and more food. So there are people pushing out overloaded boats into the Mediterranean, and the people on them say, I know I'm going to die if I live in Mali. I know I may die crossing the Mediterranean. I'm going to cross the Mediterranean. But this is a trickle of involuntary refugees from conflict in Syria, which was also a country where the conflict was really triggered by a drought, and from parts of Africa. It's a trickle compared to the tsunami which we are certain to have by the middle of the century of involuntary ecological refugees, and embedded in that number will be a small number of extremely angry young men who will want to do bad things to us, who do belong to Al-Qaeda and other things. So it's a somber picture, but it lays the foundation for what I think we can do, which I want to be optimistic about. But are there questions and comments here? Yo-ho, world fellows.
Dalton, did you have a question? You just joined via video. Or if not, I can ask Ryan's question.
Yes.
All right. So Ryan is one of our senior fellows. He's helping us with some of the biosequestration solutions like wetland restoration and biochar. And he says, I hope I'm not jumping the gun on this question, but what do you see as being the most critical leverage points for voluntarily reducing the fertility rate, especially in light of where the vast majority of the population growth is likely to take place, i.e. Africa and South Asia?
Yeah. Okay, that's where I'm moving. It's very central to my passion and the passion of the team around me. So let me try and deal with that. So I want to say the elephant's our friend. So I don't have to dwell on this because you're all committed to this. I have no doubt in my mind, in any sensible person, we have to reduce consumption. But we don't have a condom that reduces consumption. The interesting thing about population growth is that there's a very large unmet need for family planning. We define unmet need as women that are sexually active who tell surveyors they never want another child, or they don't want another child for at least 2 years, but they're not using a method of contraception. So I'm going to look as to how we can slow these things down and then show how family planning, especially in rich countries such as America, can help us mitigate our carbon output and adapt in poor countries. So this is my sort of mantra. I honestly believe it's easier to do. It's very that we can't take the carbon in the atmosphere out of it, and we all know and intensely worried about the slow progress in making to reduce the carbon going to the atmosphere. So I think that population is the variable that's slightly easier to change. So let's ask a very simple question. Why do women have fewer children? And this is the one that's enormously misunderstood, and I really don't understand why. So Bill Gates, who's a pretty intelligent person, said, he said, A, population growth is a problem. B, I know how to solve it. C, we need to reduce infant mortality. And then, like a good scientist, he showed these pictures. You can see the decline in total fertility rate, average number of children on the left, and on the right, and you can see the infant mortality on the left. And they seem to go together reasonably well. But he cherry-picked his data. This is the data that we have, again, in the vertical column on the Left, we're looking at places like Burkina, Chad, and Niger, and Uganda. Infant mortality has come down in a very impressive way. Total fertility rates remain more or less horizontal, and the population growth has gone through the roof. The panels on the right are from Bangladesh, which I know very well, Indonesia, which I know pretty well, India and Vietnam. I've worked in all those countries. Infant mortality came down, the total fertility rate came down, population growth rate is coming down, but the total fertility rate did not come down because people were having the lower infant mortality. It came down because we were giving them family planning choices. In fact, in England, the birth rate began to fall in the 1870s. The infant mortality didn't begin to fall until 1900. So this is a myth. It's a strong one, but it's a myth. And then you have people that are famous like Jeffrey Sachs, who talks about the end of poverty. And then he says, impoverished families choose to have lots of children. Jeffrey Sachs has never been in an abortion ward. In Africa, there are 6 million women every year who risk their lives having an unsafe abortion. 26,000 of them die. There are 26,000 male and female students on the Berkeley campus. And each year, as many women in Africa die as there are people on the Berkeley campus. Those people tell us 3 things. They didn't want to be pregnant. They were willing to lay down their life not to have a child that they did not want because they knew they could not give the child the love that it needed. And they didn't have the contraceptive choices they deserved. Jeffrey Sachs really pisses me off when he says impoverished families choose to have lots of children. He's just never had his feet on the ground. So my wife and I wrote an article called Do Economists Have Frequent Sex? Which caused a certain amount of amusement. But look, let's get real. In relation to my condom title, this slide, people have more sex than they need to conceive quite a large family. And self-reported rates of sex in this cross-section of countries show that if we don't use contraception, the default position for every human normal heterosexual partnership is a large family. Here's a large family. Queen Victoria had a very passionate, happy, loving, heterosexual life with her husband, Prince Albert. But no, she lived in an age when contraceptives were not available, and nobody went to the Queen and said, would you like to give Prince Albert a condom? And there weren't very good condoms at that time. She hated being pregnant. She said breastfeeding was obscene. She was Queen of England. She didn't want to have all these children, but they arrived. And so the total fertility rate in Buckingham Palace was higher than it is today in Burkina Faso, and for exactly the same number. She didn't have the knowledge and means to separate frequent sex from childbearing. So, point number 1, you can't have a smaller family until you have a way to separate sex from childbirth. Point number 2, when you get those choices, then family size often, in nearly all cases, slowed. In every Asian country I worked, once we gave people choices, and family size came down. So, the answer to the very good question was, first of all, we meet the unmet demand. If people, it's a voluntary process. And so to do that, we need large-scale family planning programs that give people choices, that empower people. And particularly in the Sahel and in Rajasthan in India and those places where you still have child marriage, we need to make a big effort, which will be very expensive, to keep girls in school. We've been doing that, and I can tell you more if you want. So, but let's look at unmet need. The blue bars are the contraceptive prevalence rate, how the percentage of married women using contraceptives in these countries. And you see none of them are more than 10% of women using contraceptives. In America, it's 60 to 70%. But the remarkable thing is the unmet need, the women who don't want another child ever or don't want it for 2 years, is much greater. So it's common sense. If we meet that unmet need, we've got to made a big step forward. And all my lifetime experience tells me that the desired family size is a moving target. When I first began in Bangladesh, where women were having 6 children, I never met a woman who said we wanted to have 2 children. But I met a lot of women who said, oh, it's been nice to have 4 or 5. And when they had 4 or 5, they said, wow, my neighbor's only got 3 and they're all going to school. Perhaps I'll have 3. And now they have 2.4. in Bangladesh, and a huge change in about 30 years because we met the unmet need, entirely voluntary. We had a meeting in Berkeley, which was published in the Philosophical Transactions of the Royal Society. Charles Darwin and Isaac Newton published there, so we felt in good company. But it was a meeting of demographers and family planners from around the world. And he pointed out several things. One is that there are 80 million unintended pregnancies each year on this planet. So if we just prevented the currently unmet unintended pregnancies, we'd actually have zero population growth on the planet tomorrow. Now, there'd still be great inequities, and we'd still face very serious problems in Africa. Secondly, they said that access to contraception and safe abortion decreases family size, even in illiterate communities living on less than $1 a day, and Bangladesh is a good example. But when this conference was published, the Economist picked it up and made it their cover story. That was my lifelong dream. How can we speak to all the people who read The Economist? And they got it upside down. They changed what we had concluded. And they said, as people get richer, they have fewer children. We said, even poor people plan their family. The reason that richer people have fewer children is often because they have the means, the money, the intelligence and the leverage to get over the unnecessary barriers that prevent poor women getting the contraceptives and safe abortions that they need. So this is how long it has taken countries to go from 6 or 7 children to a much lower fertility rate. So the bar, the blue bar, is the United States of America, which took 58 years from 1842 to 1900 to go from 7 children to about 3.5. The orange bar, with the most rapid one, going from 6 to 2, is the Islamic Republic of Iran. The last place on this planet you would expect to have a very rapid decline in population, but they made, not in population, but in fertility. Sorry, not in population, in fertility. But they made all methods available, including voluntary sterilization. There was a lot of controversy between the conservatives and the liberals. There was a lot of debate on television. They reached out into the villages, and they had a more rapid fertility decline than China did, entirely voluntary. So if you compare 2 countries I know very well, the Philippines, where the Vatican has made it difficult to get contraceptives, and Bangladesh, where we had a lot of success making them available, the poor people in the Philippines, the lowest economic quintile, labeled number 5, the blue bar, they have about 5 children. In Bangladesh, the poorest people have 3 children. In the Philippines and in Bangladesh, the richest quintile, number 1, have the same family size because they can get around these barriers. That's what wealth and education give you. But the takeaway message here is where it's easy to get family planning, then there's relatively little difference in family size between the richest and poorest people, between the most educated and the least educated, between the urban and the rural. Where it's difficult to get contraception, there are big differences. So here again, Thailand and the Philippines had the same population and the same total fertility rate in 1950. In 2050, Thailand will have 60 million people, it's still quite a lot, but the Philippines will have 152. I think the Philippines will fall apart. It won't be able to employ those people. There's been a long civil war in the south. There'll be an enormous amount of pain and suffering, women dying in childbirth, countless unsafe abortions. So one of the things that my wife and I emphasize is just the barriers that exist between what the information and means people need, normal people who have frequent sex, the means and information they need to separate frequent sex from childbearing. First of all, there's a great, you need a choice of contraceptives. At some part in your life, it might be a good idea to get condoms, another part pills, then you might wish to be sterilized. So we need to make a variety of contraceptives available. Then there are often crazy medical rules. For instance, in Africa, a lot of women, they won't give her, she walks 10 kilometers to a family planning clinic. If she's lucky and it's open, and if she's fortunate they haven't run out of supplies of contraceptives, she's then told she can't have anything because she's not menstruating. This is not, I'm a doctor, this is craziness. They're so worried that she might be pregnant. So all people, refuse women choices because they have arbitrary rules. Or people are misinformed. There's I've done studies on this, huge numbers of women, 40% in some countries, who think the pill is more dangerous than having a baby. We simply asked random selection of people, what's more dangerous, having a baby or taking the pill? They're light years different. But if somebody thinks the pill's going to give you cancer and kill you, they're not stupid not to take it. People make very savvy judgments. It's we, the providers, that are providing misinformation. You can counter that misinformation with wonderful soap operas, which we do in lots of places. This is a picture of our work in Ethiopia. Women love the injectable contraceptive. The rules are, in most of the country, only doctors and nurses can give injections. But there aren't doctors and nurses in all the villages, and when they are there, they're pretty busy. So we're teaching village volunteers like this woman here to give their neighbors the injection. It's safe. They love to do it. They're very proud of what they're doing. There are 2 priests that do it. It solves the problem. But it's very difficult to get doctors to change the rules. This is the misinformation about the pill. The red bars are the numbers of women in these countries who think the pill's more dangerous than having a baby. It's 100,000 times different. In fact, if you take the pill, this is a 39 study of oral contraceptives, you actually reduce several cancers, and women who take the pill, just for 2 or 3 years when they're young, live a few days longer than women who don't take the pill. So, you know, it's absolutely crazy misinformation. So, but the World Bank and a lot of people are making decisions like Bill Gates to put hundreds of millions of dollars into anything except making contraceptives available. So we're suggesting a paradigm which I think more people are buying into, but it's not a universal paradigm. So the people are listening to me. Am I making sense? And if I'm not, why not?
Thank you. Does anybody on the video here want to respond to that? Delton, I know you had a question too, if you want to share that via video.
Hi. Delton might want to go first. I see he's chatting now.
Anna, you can go ahead and we'll go out.
Okay. Well, thank you, Dr. Potts. I absolutely believe your explanation does make sense. If I could ask you to backtrack a little bit for those of us who aren't familiar with population modeling. My question is, first, what basic inputs are going into the model? And then secondly, this might be answered by the first part, but do you ever go from climate change modeling back into the population model? So understanding that that would be a two-way interaction rather than just population impacting climate, which we've already discussed.
Malcolm, I muted you there, so you have to unmute yourself. Or Chad, maybe you could help.
In relation to the first question, how demographers make projections, some of it is very curious. A lot of the UN projections simply assume that by the year 2100, everybody will have 2.1 children, that the low fertility countries like Greece will raise their family size and the countries like Niger will go to 2.1. There's absolutely no empirical evidence for this, and so I look more at the rates at which contraceptive prevalence is increasing. In relation to modeling, I was thinking about this only the other day. In Nature Climate, there's a Nature periodical called Nature Climate, I think. There was an article, and particularly about the way in which people who work in different disciplines live in what they call echo chambers. We all support, we talk to people who agree with us and not to people who don't agree with us. So if we're honest and it's an objective, certainly we can have very pessimistic or reasonably optimistic projections of, for example, food security in the Sahel. You know better than I do, but I also know that climate projections can also be optimistic and pessimistic. Now, the very interesting thing is this, that if you take the most optimistic climate projections, that is the least warming, and the most optimistic population projections, that is the least growth in population, and you apply that to Sahel, you still have a catastrophe, because they're dealing with such large numbers, and even minimal changes in climate change will have a big impact. If you take the worst population projections and the worst climate projections, you have a stunning mega catastrophe of the type the world's never seen before. And so I thought it's rather interesting. My intuition was that if you recognize there are difficulties and uncertainties in demographic projections and climate projections, if you put the two together, you would have a very ambiguous, sort of confused situation. But when you put it together and you actually look at the numbers, you have a very unambiguous situation. So thank you for that question.
Yeah.
And if somebody wants to join with me,
oh, I see. Right, I can see.
Delton, did you want to share via video?
Yeah, there's several questions which seem to go together. It's part about the politics. Yes, population management is controversial, and I think we need to use our words very carefully. My wife always talks about the population factor. It's never the only thing that makes a difference, but it is often a variable that if you don't look after it, you can't solve the other problems. I don't like the term population control, because in my book we are not telling people what to do, we're listening to what they want, and people want smaller families. So population is perceived as more controversial than it needs to be, I think because of the way in which we framed it, and because people have a lot of sort of misinformation. I'm reading the things again. Okay. It is partly a result of religion. Yes, certainly, the Catholic Church made a huge mistake when they condemned so-called artificial contraception, and they wouldn't, although the pill was invented by a Catholic doctor, it was condemned by the Church. 98% of Catholics ignore the Vatican ruling, but in a poor country like the Philippines, the Church has great political influence, so it actually physically denies women getting hold of contraception, which is why there's so many unintended and unsafe abortions in the Philippines. And the Church in the last few decades has taken a very hostile stance to anything to do with safe abortion, even though in the early history of the Church, actually, it was abortion wasn't condemned in such a vitriolic way. So the Catholic Church is certainly a problem. So let me keep moving because of time. Let's just look at two things which family planning can do, starting in the United States of America. This may surprise you, but half of all the pregnancies in the USA are unintended, and you can see how there's unintended pregnancy. Well, first of all, look at the purple bars at the bottom. Those are the intended births, and they begin to rise in the late teens. They're highest in the 20s and 30s, which is what they expect, and there are some women, 35 and 40 want to have a child. That's absolutely wonderful. My daughter had her first child when she was 39. But those are the wanted ones. The red ones are the unintended births, that is, babies that were born but their parents really didn't want them. And if you do big studies, obviously some people whose parents didn't want them are remarkably successful. That's the human condition. But overall, in large population studies, they don't do quite as well. A lot of those unintended pregnancies end in induced abortions, and some in spontaneous abortions. Now, there is a study north in California called Family Pact. And it's a federally funded program which makes family planning accessible to women at 200% of the poverty line or below. It's been very well evaluated, and it prevents about 100,000 unintended births every year. The women are delighted to be able to control their own fertility. So I took that 100,000 births. I assumed those people would live to an average age of 78. I assumed they'd make 19.6 tons of emissions. You may want to change that, but that would add up to 152 million tons of carbon that is prevented each year by offering people family planning. And so, and again, you may have more up-to-date costs than I do, but by every way you look at it, family planning is the most cost-effective way of reducing our carbon footprint. It's more cost-effective than solar panels, windmills. Condoms are more cost-effective than these two things. Now, we have to do all these things. So I see family planning as absolutely essential, another wedge. I'm sure I'm very impressed by the sort of wedge strategy that climate people and which you're adopting. It's another wedge, and it's one that we should value. It's low cost and highly effective, and it's a win-win situation, because everything else you do, if you put up wind power, somebody says, well, I don't want that windmill killing bats. I don't want those solar panels all over the place. If you give people family planning, they say, wow, thank you, God, that you gave me that choice. So it's number one thing. And then if you want to adapt to climate change in very, very poor countries, if you look at the countries with the greatest water stress, they're also, which are the higher the pink and red areas, they're also the areas where the highest unmet need of family planning occurs. So again, if we meet unmet need, we're helping people adapt to climate change, and much of which is inevitable. And if we look at Bangladesh, a country I love very much, now Bangladesh has got huge problems. It's got a large population. It's still growing a little bit, but it would be unable to deal with its problems if it had gone on having 6 children. Now it does have fewer, and people are getting better educated. They do face very, very serious problems. They may have the wealth to build some barriers, well, like the Dutch have done, but they face serious problems. They, in my opinion, may well be able to at least ameliorate them. If they hadn't had family planning, it would have been a disaster. Okay. So family planning is not a cost, it's an investment. It saves things, other costs, and this is my final slide. Half a child more and you have over 16 billion. Half a child less, you have 8.3. These are slightly different numbers from the ones I showed you earlier because we've updated them with new information. So again, questions and comments? Let's see if any others pop up.
I actually had a question about this
Yes.
article. This is George, by the way. This article I read in Wired a few years ago. It's about reversible inhibition of sperm under guidance. It's basically reversible male vasectomies. Wait, here's the link to the article. It was published in 2011. I was wondering if there's been any work on that. I mean, the article basically said if the research pans out, then this would be really great. But I mean, it's not something I follow every day, so I didn't know if you had any information about this.
I spent 10 years of my life leading an organization whose mission was to develop new methods of contraception, and we never developed one. We improved quite a lot of things. If you come up, with some new chemical that inhibits sperm today, it'll probably be 20 years before it gets into the market. It will still be on patent and it'll be very expensive. So I think we have to use the methods we have at the present moment. We've had some very important developments in relation to safe medical abortion. The pill is a quite remarkable invention because it imitates nature. If you had something that prevents sperm, you're trying to, can we close the mirror? Sorry, there's noise outside. You'd throw in a monkey wrench into the system and you might have more abnormal babies. Women don't ovulate when they're breastfeeding and when they're pregnant, and so the pill imitates those processes, which is why it also prevents some cancers. I don't know if you can see it here. My friends in India have Plan C. Plan B is, is the morning after pill. Plan C is actually a combination of mifepristone and misoprostol, which can give a safe early abortion. This retails for about 10 years.
You look a little bit higher than we'll be able to see it. There.
Yeah. So this is a very cheap thing that every woman in the world could afford this. The problem is in many places it's not legally available. We now have contraceptives you can implant. The best intrauterine device is one that releases progesterone, and it costs, I think, $600 United States of America, which is a tragedy. We found that we can make it for $10 in California. The Gates Foundation, nobody was interested in that. People curious enough are always looking at the next contraceptives rather than saying, what can we do better with the ones that we have, which is the road I think we should be going down. So other questions? If you don't have other questions, I'll end by telling you a story.
I'd love if you could speak a little bit more to the connection between girls' education and fertility rates and family planning.
Okay. Again, as I said, I worked a lot in Thailand, and we showed a very careful study that as fertility fell, parents kept more and more of their children in school, so that the fall in the birth rate facilitated better education. It was not the other way around. It wasn't they were getting better educated and decided to have fewer children. But where you have child marriage, as I've said, you really got a very, very serious problem. Now, we've been working in northern Nigeria in a child marriage society. The mean age of marriage is 14.9 years, which means some are getting married when they're 10 and 12 years old, where they're having 7 to 8 children. It's a polygamous society, a Hausa-speaking Muslim society. And when I first went there, I thought, we're never going to make any progress here. Remarkably, being very patient, trying to understand the society, understanding the constraints that people have, building on the fact that people that are very poor can only have to make very careful decisions. Where only 4% of girls ever went to secondary school and non-completed it, we now have 70 to 80% of girls staying in secondary school. We've got about 3,000 girls in this study, and now we want many hundreds of millions of dollars to take that to scale. And I think it's something we should all be committed to. Girls' education is an unfettered good, so is boys' education. But girls' education, they'll look after their family better. They'll be able to navigate and the problems which sometimes their husbands represent. So that's very exciting. So it is possible to keep girls in secondary school. It will be expensive, but the cost of not doing it will be much greater when societies like Somalia fall to pieces, partly driven by the population factor. We don't know how to put them together again, and it costs billions and billions of dollars to deal with those sort of situations.
Excellent, thank you. I don't think we have any other questions, and I'd love to hear a story from you.
Well, first of all, these are my takeaway messages. And then these are some websites that this will be able to. Okay, this is my story. I think we have one colleague from India on this broadcast, and you'll probably recognize this. This is the Victoria Railway Station in Mumbai, one of the busiest places in the world. So in the 1960s, the federal government in New Delhi told the medical officer of health in Bombay, who I knew, a man called Data Pai, make vasectomy available. So he found some doctors who could do vasectomies, some urologists, and put up some advertisements in not very sensible places like museums, and a handful of men, educated men, had vasectomies. And one day he put his exhibition in this railway station where as many people outside the trains as are inside them. And thousands of people saw this exhibition, and there was a panel on the pill, on intrauterine devices, on voluntary sterilization of women, on vasectomy, on condoms. And on the vasectomy panel, there were the usual pictures of a man cut in half, and there was a counselor. And if you showed interest, he talked to you, and if you said you wanted this operation, you put your thumbprint or your signature on a piece of paper. And they said, come to such and such a hospital at 5:30 on Tuesday evening. And many, many men put their thumbprints and their signatures on the piece of paper, but only a trickle came to the hospital. So one day, Dada Pai went and he sat on a bench until he saw a man put his thumbprint on the piece of paper. Then he went up to this man and said, do you want a vasectomy? And the man said, don't ask me stupid questions. I have 5 children. I don't have a job. I live on the pavement. I don't want any more children. Of course I want a vasectomy. So he said, are you going to come to the hospital on Tuesday at 5:30? And the man said, no. And Dada Pai shook him. He said, how can you be so stupid? And the man fought back. And he said, in India, you only go to hospital to die. If this operation's as safe as you say it is, why do I have to go to a hospital? And this was Dada Pai's epiphany. He said, you know, I'm sorry, I was impulsive, because he realized that it's not facts, it's people's perceptions that drive the use of contraception. So very, very impetuous, and I'm a bit, Dada was a good friend, and we're both a bit impetuous. Dada said, if I did the operation here on platform 9 tomorrow morning, would you have it? And the man said, of course. So he got a little tent, he got a small table, he got the stove you take when you go camping to boil the water. And in 1 month, he'd done more vasectomies on platform 9 than in all the hospitals of Bombay in the previous year. And that really is both true, because I know it's true, because I learned to do vasectomies on that railway station. So, but it's a parable also. It encapsulates everything that we need to do about family planning. It's respecting people, listening to their problems, realize that the barriers are very real to individuals. We may not understand them, but we need to understand them. And when we change the framework and knock down the barriers, then the person says, wow, that's great. And so, you know, that's my sermon, my parable.
Wow, what a wonderful story.
Here's one of these cups. Yeah. Here's another tie. This is from Vietnam, where OK, if you can see it, is the brand image for a condom. And this is a special tie because it actually carries a condom in a little package at the end. So, again, I think you need a sense of humor for family planning. You've got to make people smile. Sex is a wonderful and loving thing, and there's nothing more important in the world than having children that we love, that we invest in, that we educate, that we keep healthy, and that's what family planning is about. So it's really one of the most positive and wonderful things we can do, and it's very, very central, I think, to everything that you're trying to do, and which I very much applaud. And so it's been a great joy to be trying to communicate with you, and if there are additional questions, I'll be happy to answer them. And I think this goes out in some sort of permanent record, does it? Okay, well that would be
we'll have this
exciting. And you can help me. I want to be able to do this thing to other audiences. So the more questions you ask, the more you criticize, the more you say, well, that was interesting, but it's a bit I didn't understand. That will help me improve what I'm doing. So thank you.
We have one final question here from Ryan, asking, and he kind of answered this in this last story, but what do you think are the most effective or appropriate contraceptives for the developing world now and moving into the future? And then a follow-up, what research do you think is offering the most promising avenues moving forward?
Okay. I'm not being flippant, but I think the answer is it's exactly what a person wants to use. You know, contraceptive interrupters is as good as condoms. It was associated with fertility decline in France and in Turkey. So the trick is not the trick. The policy is to give people information, every method, including the pill, does have side effects. Tell people about the side effects. Tell them about the effectiveness. Put things in proportion. When I was prescribing the pill as a young doctor in Cambridge in the 1960s, women were very frightened to take the pill because at high doses there had been some deaths. And so I used to say to a young woman, you know, I said, this is a calculation, it's an accurate one. The risk of taking the pill for those high-dose pills, which did have dangers, is equivalent to smoking 1/3 of a cigarette every day. And the women would relax and say, okay, now I understand. If you say the risk of death is, you know, 1.52 in 100,000, it doesn't mean anything. You've got to put risks and benefits in ways that people can understand. I think pills, injections are very effective, and you don't need doctors to get them around. You do need somebody to put in an intrauterine device, but you can train rather junior people to do that. You could train a whole variety of people to do vasectomies. It's more difficult to do female sterilization. With medical abortion, you can put that in the shop, and again, you can have a package inside that tells you how to do it. So those are the things that we can do in any society, and I think our future research should be focused on the cost of making things available and of getting understanding providers and understanding their biases and persuading doctors to shift tasks, persuading doctors that somebody in the village can be taught to give her neighbor an injection. I think that's where we should put our research. We have another person here. This is a wonderful friend of my wife and myself, Elia Zulu, who's founded a thing called the African Institute for Development Policy. I'm not sure if it was in our emails, but it's AFIDEP, A-F-I-D-E-P, Institute for Development Policy.org. And this is Africans who are demographers and development people speaking to ministers of health, speaking to ministers of finance, saying what the problems are, because Africa quite rightly doesn't want to listen to people from outside. They want to listen to white-haired white men like me. They want, and they want somebody that's diplomatic and has got all the information there. And so that's one of the things we're doing. And so I think we need why I'm enjoying this privilege of being with you is that we need a very close friendship and trust between the people interested in climate and global warming and the people interested in population, because we've got common goals, and we're involved in very big behavior changes.
Malcolm, actually, we have two other questions.
Yes.
From some of our fellows. Kelly Simon is asking, and you may have addressed this in part already, but what's a good response then when countries like Singapore have a specific aim of raising their population, complete with birth bonuses, for economic development and growth? And then I think another question that's perhaps somewhat related. And she says, as a woman in the U.S., I'm constantly aware of the family planning budget cuts or the stipulations on funding, if there is any, here in the U.S. How do you view family planning in the U.S. or the more developed countries, particularly in respect to women's rights?
Yeah, I think it's the number one woman's right. You can't be an autonomous woman unless you can make decisions about your fertility. And family planning is far too expensive in this country. I would like to see the pill off prescription. That's what the science tells you. That's what the American College of Obstetricians and Gynecologists says should happen. The American Academy of Adolescent Science. The pill should be beside aspirins in the gas station or in the vending machine. So we need to make things more readily available. And we are suffering terribly from these right-wing extremists who want to control women. And it's very sad. For those people, I would tell them every unwanted pregnancy when it grows up will vote Democratic. So the other question, Chad, was...
There's another question.
No, this question had two parts. One was...
one was about the U.S.
Oh, yes, the other one was about aging populations. And again, as fertility falls in societies, there's inevitably, it's like gravity, you will have a change in the population structure. You'll have some aging of that society. We know the person who chaired the Pension Commission in the United Kingdom, Lord Adair Turner. And they showed that if you raise the age of retirement in very small increments, a few months each year for about 10 years, from 65 to 75, you got rid of almost all the economic burden which we have because people are getting older. And most people, and I'm a good example, I've just had my 80th birthday, I'm fitter than my parents were at my age. I'm doing what many people do, which is a service job. I don't have to lift heavy weights. I don't have to work down a coal mine. I can go on working for longer. And so that is what they should be doing in Singapore. And I think a lot of this is just a primitive nationalism that, Putin wants to have more Russians because the idea that makes him a stronger country, which isn't the case. The strong countries are the ones that have the lower birth rates. I'm going to introduce my wife.
Excellent.
Hello.
And we should be honest, we have 6 children between us, but they're from 2 previous marriages. But again, people often get worried. I mean, I want to live in a world of wanted children, and there will be people who want quite large families, and people who don't want any children, and people who want one child. And the empirical evidence is that sort of, balances out reasonably well. So what we want are children that people want, that they will invest in, they will look after, they will educate, and will become, if you like, people who can have a job and get married, who can have a home, and can do the same to the next generation. It's a very, very simple mission and policy that we have. It's just our difficulty of getting the message across. So I hope you can help us get the family planning message across, and I'm certainly committed to getting the climate message across in the things that I do.
Excellent. It's a deal.
Good.
I think that's it, Chad, unless you have any other questions coming in.
Delton Chen asks a question, do you think that the rich countries should finance developing countries to improve family planning?
It's a good question. I think we should. Take the example of AIDS. When I started AIDS, nobody was interested in it. Then it got a lot of money, and when money arrived, countries changed their policies because there was money there, even in ways that weren't already evidence-based. I think currently in America, every person gives the equivalent to the cost of one hamburger to international family planning each year. So if we doubled our investment in family planning, it's not going to affect us as taxpayers. There's a lot of misunderstanding about how much money goes into development. So I think we should be putting a lot of money into family planning, girls' education, and accept the fact that when you put a lot of money into something, almost in a crisis situation, some of it will be badly spent. But a lot of defense money is badly spent. What we want is to have sufficient money that the Minister of Finance says to the Minister of Health, I'm not interested in family planning, but those crazy people in America want to give me more money, so you do something about it. I'm a bit cynical along those lines, but the worst problems are in countries like Chad, like Somalia, like Yemen. Yemen's falling apart. Yemen's running out of water, for goodness sake, the first country in the world to have no water. So, and there's a fight going on, and the Saudis have got bombers going on, and the Sunnis and Shiites are fighting each other. It's a horrible tragedy, and population factor is one part of it. So yes, and we should look at it. If we were to spend 1.4% of the US defense budget, 1.4%, we would have $6 billion in family planning, which is the UN estimate of the cost of taking family planning to every woman on this planet who wants it. So I think for anybody, whatever their policies, for everybody in the Ministry of Defense, and they're very thoughtful people, for everybody in the Pentagon, and I've spoken in the Pentagon, 1.4% of the American defense budget put into family planning will be the best thing they could buy. The pill is mightier than the sword.
Excellent. Excellent.
I love it.
Great.
All right. I think on that note, we can conclude this session. Thank you so much for sharing your time with us today, and we're really excited about spreading this message within the climate conversation. I think it's so important. And like many of the solutions that we're looking at, it's not just about carbon, it's about equality and justice and the health and wealth of people around the world.
I know my colleague Alicia Grace is part of your network, and she is in Niger today teaching family planning demography in her impeccable French to people, so that's very exciting, and she's the generation that's going to follow me, and she'll be much more effective and much prettier.
Well, I know that you've been very effective your time, and will continue to. You've inspired many, including my mom, to work in population and to continue with this work. So thank you. All right. We'll sign off. Thank you so much for joining us, everyone, and thank you for watching the recording. For those that are watching that. Right.
Thank you.
Take care, everyone. Bye.